Ladies and gentlemen, if we are to understand the endurance of a nation, we must begin not with weapons or treaties, but with memory. Memory, collective and ancient, is the soil in which resistance takes root. Iran, a civilization older than many of the empires that sought to subdue it, has never truly forgotten the sting of intrusion. From the invasions of Alexander the Great to the manipulations of modern superpowers, its people have been shaped by an unbroken narrative of survival. History teaches many nations to forgive. Iran remembers. When Western powers orchestrated the 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, replacing a democratically elected government with monarchical rule, a wound was left unhealed. That act, though decades old, lives on in the Iranian consciousness, not as history, but as lived reality. And that memory forms the bedrock of a national posture that refuses to kneel. But memory alone does not make resistance sustainable. It must be fused with meaning. In Iran, meaning is drawn from a potent mixture of ideology and identity. The revolution of 1979 was more than a political uprising. It was a reclaiming of voice, a severing of dependence, a declaration that sovereignty could not be dictated by foreign interests. Since then, Iran's path has not been perfect, but it has been intentional. The nation's leadership, often portrayed in Western media through the narrow lens of hostility, has in fact cultivated a strategic doctrine. This doctrine is not one of reckless provocation, but of asymmetry. When you cannot match your adversary's firepower, you develop new forms of leverage. Proxy networks, cyber capabilities, and regional influence have become tools of balance. And while critics may condemn these tactics, few can deny their effectiveness. What we witness today is not a state surviving by chance. It is a state that has learned, painfully and persistently, how to absorb blows and redirect pressure. Sanctions have hurt, yes, but they have also forced innovation. Domestic manufacturing has grown. Trade routes have been diversified. Alliances with non-Western powers have taken on new importance. Iran, in many ways, has turned isolation into strategy. And here lies a deeper truth, one that transcends politics and enters the realm of psychology. Iran does not view resistance as a temporary posture. It views resistance as an identity. The more it is challenged, the more it believes it must stand firm. In this mindset, compromise is not diplomacy, it is surrender. And so, the harder the pressure, the stronger the resolve. This is not to romanticize or defend all of Iran's choices. The country, like any other, has its share of contradictions, internal struggles, and moments of misjudgment. But if the question is why it cannot be broken by external power, then the answer lies not in its missiles, but in its mindset. To confront such a nation is to misunderstand it. To seek its submission is to deny the forces that have shaped it over millennia. Empires have risen and fallen. Shahs have ruled and been overthrown. Ideologies have shifted and adapted, but the will to remain Iranian, independent, proud, and defiant has never left. That, in the end, is the secret. Not in the strength of arms, not in oil, not even in alliances. The secret is in the soul of a people who have decided time and again that their dignity is not for sale. And so, while the world debates tactics and strategies, Iran stands, battered, yes, but unbowed. Not because it is the strongest, but because it refuses to forget who it is. Iran's resistance to Western power cannot be understood through surface-level analysis of its military strength or political maneuvers. The secret lies deeper in the sediment of history, where memory becomes a source of endurance. This is not the kind of memory that gathers dust in textbooks. It is a living memory, transmitted through stories, rituals, language, and collective experience. It has shaped a national consciousness that does not easily yield. Iran's identity, forged over thousands of years, carries the imprints of empires, betrayals, uprisings, and survival. And this memory is what gives Iran its unbreakable core. To begin, one must go back thousands of years to the Persian Empire, an empire that rivaled Rome, whose influence stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. That imperial legacy still echoes in the Iranian psyche. Unlike many modern nation-states that were carved by colonial borders, Iran existed as a civilization long before many others took form. Its people do not see themselves as a young republic grappling with modernity, but as heirs of an ancient culture that has already seen the rise and fall of global powers. This long historical arc creates a perspective where short-term pressures, economic sanctions, political isolation, media campaigns, are absorbed into a broader narrative of endurance. But this historical pride does not rest in the distant past alone. It is sharpened and made relevant by more recent events, especially those involving Western interference. Among these, the 1953 CIA and MI6-backed coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh stands as a foundational trauma. Mossadegh had moved to nationalize Iran's oil, reclaiming control from British interests. In response, he was removed and replaced with a monarchy that would remain loyal to Western powers. For many Iranians, this event is not just a chapter in their national story, it is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting external powers. It solidified a deep-seated suspicion and a fierce insistence on sovereignty. It also left behind a scar that every generation has been taught to recognize, that independence is fragile and must be guarded at all costs. That memory alone might not lead to resistance, but when paired with the 1979 revolution, it gains power. The revolution was not simply a rejection of the Shah's dictatorship. It was a wholesale repudiation of foreign domination. It was a cry from the soul of a people who had decided to wrest control of their destiny, even at great cost. For the West, the revolution was shocking and threatening. For Iranians, it was redemptive. It was an act of national resurrection, a return to principles that they believed had been suppressed by decades of external manipulation and internal decay. And it gave birth to a political culture where resistance was not a choice, but a duty. That culture has since been passed down, not only in speeches or official narratives, but in daily life. It exists in the poetry taught to school children, in the mourning rituals for martyrs, and the commemorations of resistance. It is present in the stories of grandparents who recall life under occupation or dictatorship, and in the pride felt when Iran refuses to bow to international demands. These are not manufactured sentiments. They are generational responses to lived experience. While the world watches headlines, Iran listens to its history, and that history whispers, We have faced greater enemies than these. Furthermore, the geopolitical position of Iran has only amplified this historical consciousness. Surrounded by instability, targeted by sanctions, threatened by war, Iran has responded not with surrender but with resilience. It has turned memory into strategy. It has taught itself how to endure economically, militarily, and psychologically. It has chosen to define power not as domination, but as the capacity to withstand, and that capacity is not measured in tanks or currency. It is measured in how long a people can hold on to their story, even when the world tries to rewrite it. Iran's strength against Western pressure cannot be understood without examining the powerful role ideology plays in shaping its national unity. For Iran, resistance is not a reaction. It is a philosophy. It is a framework that informs policy, shapes society, and sustains the population during periods of extreme pressure. While nations across the world have political systems built around pragmatism, Iran's political architecture is laced with a unique fusion of religious conviction, historical purpose, and anti-imperial resistance. This ideological structure may be complex, but it has proven astonishingly resilient. At the heart of this ideology is the principle of istiqlal, independence. Iran's revolution was not merely about removing a monarch. It was a deliberate attempt to redefine what sovereignty meant in the modern world. The leadership that emerged from that revolution was determined to build a system that could not be co-opted by global powers. Thus, they embedded the idea that submission to Western political and economic dominance was not only unwise, but unholy. This conviction was not simply political rhetoric. It was moral doctrine. The message delivered from the pulpits and political platforms alike was that resistance is righteousness and dependency is decay. This ideological core helped unite a nation that is, in truth, diverse and complex. Iran is not a monolith. It is home to many ethnic groups, social classes, and competing political factions, from reformists who seek change within the system to hardliners who champion defiance. Iran's internal landscape is filled with debate. Yet, when the nation is confronted by external threats, particularly those from the West, a remarkable unity emerges. It is not always agreement in belief, but alignment in purpose. The narrative that Iran is under siege from foreign powers is not just promoted by the government. It is widely felt across society. And this perceived siege strengthens the ideological call to solidarity. The use of religion in this ideological framework is not incidental, it is central. The revolution fused Shia Islam with political authority, creating a theocratic system that does not separate spiritual obligations from civic duty. In this view, opposing imperialism is not just a national necessity, it is a religious responsibility. Martyrdom, sacrifice, and steadfastness have been elevated as the highest virtues. These values are not only preached but lived. Through commemorations like Ashura, where historical acts of resistance are reenacted and reimagined as symbols of eternal struggle against tyranny. In such rituals, the line between religious memory and political resistance is erased. It becomes one story: the righteous must always stand against the oppressor, no matter the cost. And yet, this ideological cohesion is not solely dependent on religious devotion. There is a strong nationalistic element embedded within it. The pride in Iran's pre-Islamic history, its cultural achievements, its linguistic heritage, all these are folded into the broader message of self-reliance. Whether secular or religious, many Iranians share the sense that their nation has something unique to protect, something worth enduring hardship for. This pride, even when it exists apart from theology, feeds the broader ideological machine. We are not like others, and we will not be ruled like others. Iran's leaders have understood this ideological depth and used it to manage public sentiment during times of hardship. When sanctions bite, when inflation rises, when isolation grows, the government does not apologize for its stance, it invokes sacrifice. It reminds citizens that this struggle is not for comfort, but for dignity. It reframes suffering as contribution and inconvenience as participation in a moral cause. This is not always received without criticism. Many Iranians voice frustration and fatigue. But the larger ideological story has enough gravity to hold society together. Enough to prevent collapse. Enough to withstand foreign pressure. And so, abundant. Importantly, this ideological narrative also travels beyond Iran's borders. It has become part of a larger discourse in the Muslim world and in parts of the global South, where Iran is seen not just as a country resisting Western domination, but as a symbol of how resistance can be structured, organized, and sustained. Whether one agrees with Iran's politics or not, it cannot be denied that it has created a model of ideological coherence that gives it strength in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, Iran's resistance is not built merely on defiance. It is built on belief. Belief in its right to choose its own path. Belief in the virtue of struggle. Belief in the danger of submission. And belief in the idea that unity, when grounded in shared meaning, is stronger than fear. This belief may be challenged, but as history has shown, it will not be easily dismantled. One of the most striking features of Iran's unyielding posture in the face of Western pressure is its remarkable ability to adapt. While many countries buckle under the weight of economic sanctions, political isolation, or military threats, Iran has learned how to survive and even maneuver strategically within these constraints. Adaptation in Iran is not a desperate reaction. It is a long-term strategy, cultivated through experience, necessity, and a deep understanding of power asymmetry. Over the years, Iran has refined the art of turning disadvantage into innovation and pressure into opportunity. When sanctions began to intensify, many expected Iran's economy to collapse, leading to public unrest and political change. And yes, the economic pain has been real. Inflation, unemployment, and shortages have taken a toll on ordinary people. But unlike fragile states that depend heavily on foreign aid or imported systems, Iran began to build internal resilience. It redirected investments into domestic manufacturing, agriculture, and technological development. The goal was not to eliminate dependency entirely, that would be unrealistic in a globalized world, but to reduce vulnerabilities in strategic sectors. Iran began producing its own cars, pharmaceuticals, and industrial goods, not because it wanted to isolate itself, but because it had to. Perhaps the most visible example of this adaptive resilience has been Iran's energy sector. When access to international financial systems was blocked and oil exports were restricted, Iran sought creative ways to sell its resources. Barter deals, regional exchanges, and covert shipping routes became instruments of survival. These workarounds didn't always produce optimal outcomes, but they ensured that the economic lifeblood of the country did not stop flowing. Moreover, Iran invested in alternative energy and refinery development to lessen its dependency on crude exports. In doing so, it demonstrated a capacity to rethink its own economic structure in response to external chokeholds. But adaptation was not limited to economics. Strategically, Iran evolved its security and military doctrine to align with its limitations and strengths. Recognizing it could not compete directly with the advanced military technology of the United States or its allies, Iran focused on asymmetric capabilities. It developed ballistic missiles with significant range, invested heavily in drone technology, and cultivated proxy networks across the Middle East. These moves were not random. They were strategic tools, designed to counterbalance conventional weaknesses. Instead of matching firepower with firepower, Iran developed ways to create pressure points that could influence regional outcomes. Through this model, it extended its reach without overextending its resources. Iran also adapted diplomatically. While relations with the West remained tense, it strengthened ties with countries that shared its interests in multipolarity: Russia, China, Venezuela, and others. These relationships provided not just economic relief, but political alternatives. The development of the Look East policy was a calculated shift aimed at repositioning Iran within a changing global order. Rather than remaining trapped in a Western-dominated narrative, Iran chose to engage in partnerships that offered mutual benefits without conditions of political submission. This adaptive mindset extended to culture and technology as well. When access to global digital platforms and services was restricted, Iran began building its own domestic internet infrastructure, its own social media platforms, and even homegrown tech companies. While the motives behind some of these actions include control and surveillance, they also reflect a broader ambition to maintain functionality in a world where external access can be revoked overnight. Iran's youth, tech-savvy, and increasingly global in their outlook, have found ways to navigate this restricted environment, using VPNs, coding communities, and encrypted networks to stay connected. In this digital underground, adaptation becomes not just survival, but defiance. Even on the ideological front, adaptation has taken place. The Iranian government has had to adjust its narrative, particularly for younger generations who are less swayed by traditional revolutionary rhetoric. Instead of relying solely on religious fervor, the state now blends nationalism, cultural pride, and technological ambition into its public messaging. It frames resistance not just as a moral duty, but as a sophisticated and modern project of independence. This ideological recalibration is part of how the state maintains a degree of legitimacy, even when material conditions are strained. In sum, Iran's ability to adapt in the face of persistent pressure is one of the key reasons why its resistance has not only endured but become more sophisticated. It has restructured its economy, evolved its military doctrine, diversified its alliances, and recalibrated its internal messaging, all while navigating one of the most punishing sanctions regimes in modern history. Iran may not always thrive, but it has refused to collapse. It has chosen transformation over capitulation, strategy over submission. And that choice, repeated year after year, has made it far more difficult to break than its adversaries anticipated. The enduring resistance of Iran to Western power is not merely a matter of politics, economics, or military strategy. It is deeply psychological. Beneath the headlines, the speeches, and the sanctions lies a mindset shaped by centuries of struggle, and the internalization of resistance as a defining feature of national identity. For Iran, defiance is not simply a political stance. It is an emotional and cultural posture. It is a worldview that sees pressure not as a signal to surrender, but as a test of dignity. And in the Iranian psyche, dignity is non-negotiable. This mindset has been forged through repeated encounters with foreign domination. Iran is a country that remembers being invaded, manipulated, and dismissed. From the ancient invasions by Alexander the Great, to the colonial-era carving of the Middle East, to the 20th century coups and sanctions, the nation has faced one form of external imposition after another. These experiences have not only shaped Iran's political history, they have embedded in the national consciousness a deep-seated conviction that submission leads to loss of self. For many Iranians, this is not abstract. It is a lived fear, passed down through generations. To resist, therefore, is not simply patriotic, it is existential. This psychological orientation can be seen in the way Iranians interpret suffering. In Western frameworks, prolonged economic hardship is often expected to create unrest, weaken government authority, and push populations toward accommodation. But in Iran, suffering is often viewed through a different lens, one that draws from religious, historical, and cultural sources. It becomes a symbol of endurance, a badge of honor. This is especially resonant in Shia Islam, where the narratives of martyrdom and resistance against tyranny are central. The story of Imam Hussein at Karbala, who chose death over submission to injustice, is not just a religious tale. It is a cultural metaphor for how Iranians understand struggle. In this light, sanctions, threats, and isolation are not merely burdens, they are modern forms of Karbala, requiring steadfastness, sacrifice, and spiritual defiance. Even outside of religious frameworks, this ethos persists. Iranian literature, cinema, and poetry are filled with themes of perseverance, betrayal by outsiders, and the quest to remain whole in a fractured world. The cultural imagination of Iran is steeped in the idea that identity is tested not in times of ease, but in moments of great challenge. As a result, external pressure often strengthens rather than weakens collective resolve. It affirms the deeply held belief that Iran stands alone because it refuses to compromise its soul. This defiant psychology is not limited to leaders or elites. It extends across social and generational lines. Even Iranians who are critical of their government often bristle at foreign threats or interventions. There is a strong instinct to close ranks when the country is pressured from outside. The message is simple. We may criticize our own, but we will not allow others to dominate us. This dynamic complicates the assumptions behind many Western strategies. It means that pressure does not always isolate the government from the people. Sometimes it does the opposite. It binds them together, not through love or approval, but through shared defiance. Moreover, this psychological stance is reinforced by pride. Iranians see themselves as inheritors of one of the world's oldest civilizations. Their contributions to science, literature, art, and philosophy are not ancient relics. They are points of national pride. The idea that such a civilization should bow to the dictates of newer global powers feels, to many, like a distortion of justice. It offends the cultural ego. It inspires a desire not just to endure, but to show the world that Iran will not be reduced to dependency or silence. This is why efforts to coerce Iran through humiliation or isolation often backfire. The more a nation rooted in dignity feels attacked, the more it reaches for inner strength. And in Iran, that inner strength is not just rhetorical. It is woven into the way people think, feel, and act. It becomes part of the emotional landscape, shaping how choices are made, how threats are perceived, and how long people are willing to suffer without giving in. In the end, Iran's resistance endures, not because it has the strongest weapons or the largest economy, but because it has cultivated a collective psychology that treats resistance as virtue and compromise as dishonor. This mindset cannot be bombed, sanctioned, or negotiated away. It must be understood. Because unless one understands the psychology of defiance, one will forever misread the true source of Iran's unbreakable resolve.